99.1 The Sports Animal. Welcome back to Sports Talk with John and Vince. Pleased to be joined by MLB Insider for ESPN. He's the guy for ESPN in terms of the Major League Baseball draft, prospects, and the minors going up to Major League Baseball. Kiley McDaniel, you can follow him on X. It's Kiley, KILEY MCD. Kiley, Vince Ferrara here in Knoxville. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Man, appreciate it. Obviously, the University of Tennessee got things really going. Tony Vitello's won 40 plus games, 5 consecutive years. It's kind of a new world now in terms of Tennessee and draft prospects these days versus maybe those lean years of Tennessee baseball prior to.
Yeah, I remember when I was at the SEC tournament a couple years ago with that like historic Tennessee team, and it was
Mhm.
I think it was the night game against LSU, I want to say, where you'd think the audience, the crowd would be sort of 50-50, and it was like 80-20, and all the scouts are just like, yeah, there's dudes that thought they would die before they'd see like a number one seed like volunteers like there, and it was like old dudes and like and going with their kids. It looked like a whole thing. Whereas like LSU just like, yeah, we're just kind of here every year. Like, what do you want? So yeah, I grew up as an Alabama fan, so I'd never really, had a ton of affection for Tennessee, and then I've slowly moved into this more objective, like 30,000 foot view of things. So it's a lot easier to disassociate from those sorts of things.
Yeah, there you go. Our audience would appreciate that for sure.
Yeah.
Kind of a rival a little bit. I mean, it's not as intense in baseball as it is in football, but the elite league. So I want to ask you about some of the guys on Tennessee's roster now. We'll get to some of the guys in the minor leagues and guys that have worked their way up to the majors as well. Give me your top prospect on this current Tennessee team for the big leagues, in your opinion, as you came out with the new MLB Draft Rankings 2.0 here this week?
I think it's Billy Amick. He's in a group with a bunch of college third basemen from sort of the Power Five conferences, which is another thing that I may refer to, that we're seeing more and more of the good players get into fewer and fewer teams because of NIL and the portal and stuff like that, obviously happening in other sports as well. But as a quick aside, I would imagine 7 of the 8 teams in Omaha being power programs like it was last year with Oral Roberts as like the surprise. I would imagine that will be the standard going forward. Is there's just, if you have a hole in a recruiting class, you just go get somebody. And obviously the mid majors can't really do that, and they're losing guys. So Amick obviously came over from Clemson. He was a standout, I would say, as like a freshman that played a little bit, that had big power, and has slowly improved along the way, where he is probably a third baseman in pro ball. That's sort of a question. Is it third base, corner, outfield, maybe eventually first base? He's a corner player. But teams see him as at sort of a big league projection as like plus power, 25-ish homers, with a pretty good approach, but sort of the swing and miss in the zone is sort of the question. So is he a 240, 250 hitter? If he's a 260 hitter, maybe you take him picks 10 to 15. If you think he's more of a 230, 240 hitter, then maybe he's like sort of back of the first round, 25 or 30 overall. He's in that glut of players outside of the top tier of 10 players. I have him at 16. And in that tier, there's wildly different takes. Cameron Smith at Florida State, Tommy White at LSU, a lot of guys that are kind of similar sorts of guys, and teams have very different takes. So he's going to get kind of caught in that spin cycle and might go 11 and might go 26. It's just hard to say at this point. But yeah, if you see him in A-ball next year and he's hitting 270 with a bunch of home runs, then he's probably a big leaguer. And if he's not doing that, then it might take a little bit longer.
Kiley McDaniel, ESPN MLB Insider Draft Analyst, joining us here on Sports Talk. So who would be next in terms of the draftable players from the University of Tennessee?
So that I think is a good question, because I got 4 guys all pretty close to each other at the
Mhm.
point. I got them 40, 43, 52, and 71, and that's including high school and junior college players. It's not just the college list.
Mhm.
And you could kind of put those guys in any order. I have Blake Burke at the back of those 4 just because he's sort of first base only, a little bit limited. There is a route where he turns into somebody like, say, Matt Adams, who's like really useful for the first couple years at the major league minimum. And then once he gets to arbitration, he's making 3 or 4 million, not as coveted. But I think everybody thinks this guy's a big leaguer. He's got real power. He can hit. He's better than this sort of like the stiff softball player kind of guy that you typically see rounds, 4 through 10, or the sluggers in the SEC. So I think he's toward the back just because of the positional limitation. I think Christian Moore is probably at the top of that group. He was a guy going all the way back to, I mean, I've been watching him since sophomore, junior year of high school. I think the in-game power is taking a step forward. The hit tool has always been seen as good. He's not a shortstop, but I think he can kind of play everywhere else. And then performing in the SEC in a year where there's not a ton of good hitters in that second tier. It's down a little bit from last year's class, and the high school hitter class is terrible. So I think some of these college guys are getting moved up a bit. And then also because the SEC continues to get better because of, transfer portal and NIL and all that kind of stuff, performing in the league is more important than it's ever been. I got Drew Beam and Kavares Tears in the sort of the middle group of that. Beam is one of those guys that was seen as I think I had him about 20th or so entering the year, has been hit around a little more than people expected, but the stuff is still good, and it seems like he's turning a corner. Some scouts think he might be the fourth college pitcher off the board. There's three consensus guys at the top that'll go in the first 15 picks, and then it's a giant question mark. He could be the fourth guy if he finishes hot. Um, and then Tears is just another guy that I think is, the sort of classic, like very good at a lot of different things, maybe doesn't have the huge standout tool or like the all-star upside. But in the middle of the second round, if you find a big leaguer, you're doing better than everybody else. And so that's sort of the sales pitch for him.
Awesome stuff. Now, what about the beyond that in terms of guys that are maybe in that third tier? I know you have Dylan Dreiling in your rankings. So it would be some other guys to kind of keep an eye on in terms of draftable from this Tennessee team beyond what you mentioned.
Dreiling's the big name because he doesn't have massive raw power and he looks like he'll be limited to left field. That's one of those guys where it's like if he really, really hits, he could be a low end everyday guy. If he doesn't, then he's more of a fourth outfielder. And so that's kind of the profile to look at for him. In terms of like the draft eligible this year guys, those are the ones that are sort of getting all the attention. There's, I mean, as I'm sure you're aware, a number of guys that are eligible next year or even the year after. Obviously, Nate Snead throws real hard, which is an notable thing that a lot of people like.
Yeah.
But yeah, if we're talking about the guys that seem like good shots to go in the top 3, 4 rounds this year, that's the list of guys. And then if I were to jump into the next couple classes, then I think you've definitely got some other guys that are in that conversation.
The throwing hard stuff from the University of Tennessee kind of worked out for Garrett Crochet, right? I mean, he's been
Yep.
great for the White Sox.
Ben Joyce in the big leagues right
Yep.
away. That's yeah.
Mhm.
There's certainly been some guys that have maybe even overperformed even their draft position after leaving.
So what about visiting with Kiley McDaniel from ESPN talking about Tennessee and the MLB draft? What about Tennessee commits? Because you have a number of them on your list because that's really been, I think, part of the secret sauce for Tony Vitello is they haven't been in recent years completely wiped out with the draft. They're getting some of those elite players on campus. Certainly some have signed with MLB too, but that's what I think some of the big programs, the sustained programs have been able to do is you get some on campus and you lose some to the draft. What about those guys that are part of the upcoming signing class as Tennessee commits?
Yeah, it's really exciting. I know fans are obviously annoyed by this. Like, oh, we have a high school commit that's projected to be a first round pick. That's great. He's not going to be here. And so, where's that line where you can actually be excited about a guy maybe getting to campus?
Right.
And typically for the SEC programs, where obviously now with some NIL money, but on top of that, typically if you don't get to 750K or a million, the opportunity to go play 3 years in the SEC is such that most guys won't sign. And so that cutoff is sort of late second, early third, right around like say 80 or 90 in my rankings. And Tennessee has just, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 guys that made my top 154, and then actually 3 guys that just missed it. So they got a lot of guys in the mix that are just outside of that group where if everything sort of plays out the way everyone expects, where it's like, all right, I'm going to a big school. I think I'm $1 million player. I get offered 750. I'm going to go to school and I think I can be worth 2 or 3 million. That's sort of the typical thought process. There's a number of guys, and Tennessee, I think, has been one of the schools in the SEC that's been best at this, at not necessarily chasing the first round picks where it's kind of a waste of time, but chasing the guys below that. So we got at 93, I've got Manny Marine, a shortstop out of Florida. Now he's old enough that he'll be eligible as a sophomore, but advanced glove, bat to ball skills, and the being eligible as a sophomore is a positive for the Volunteers because teams really ding high school players that are old for the class. Sometimes they can be old, but not be old enough to be sophomore eligible. He is one of those guys. So he could be a sort of day one starter that could have 2 really impactful years and go really high. In the Maui Ahuna mold, there's obviously guys that have done that before.
Mhm.
Tegan Coons is another guy out of Pennsylvania, a big right-hander. Also will be sophomore eligible. He's at that age. He had like late first round buzz coming into the spring. Velo's been down a little bit. He sort of added a cutter some scouts don't love. It just hasn't come together in that way. So he's another guy that could be thrown in the upper 90s on campus next year and give you 2 really good years before going really high in the draft. Trey Snyder, another one, a high school shortstop out of Missouri. He's also in this range. Had him 131 back to back with Coons. Another guy that has a chance to be a day one starter. Also, maybe he gets offered 1.5 million and he signs. Like he's in that range where that could happen. Maybe he gets offered 6 or 700K and he says no. Like it's in that area where we're still kind of dialing in, I would say, as an industry exactly if you're more of a 70th overall player consensus or 120, which sounds like a lot, but it's actually like a very small difference. And then Jay Abernathy is the last guy on the rankings of that type. Another guy that's very easy to understand. He's a 70, maybe even 80 grade runner, which is the top of the scale. Maybe not a shortstop in pro ball, maybe good enough in college, more of a second base center fielder. Think of, a guy that kind of slaps it gap to gap. It was a little bit disappointing this spring in Atlanta high school ball, but I've also watched him face 90 multiple times this spring, put the bat on the ball. So it's not like he's not hitting. It's just not quite as much as you want to be able to pay a guy that's a little smaller than average out of high school. And then the 3 names that were just after that, Ty Southasine, another shortstop, another guy that's going to be sophomore eligible, 19 on draft day. Another guy that could be a day one starter, Anson Siebert, a big pitcher up into the upper 90s out of Kansas, who had a recent injury. I haven't heard how serious that is. It sounds like he should be fine. And then Levi Clark, another guy that actually saw a matchup with Abernathy in a high school game. Think sort of squatty, fullback looking guy that catches, but is more of an offense, hit power over defense kind of guy. Could be another guy that maybe DH catches and then works his way into more after that. But yeah, as you can see, it took me a while to get through all those names because there's a lot of them, which is a really good sign because you don't want to have to go into the portal for 5 new guys every year.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, obviously, the portal's been really good to Tennessee as well. That's why they're number one and really good, putting it all together. Real quick, before we get to the guys in the minor leagues, Kylie, wondering if you're tracking the potential of the NCAA giving full scholarships to everybody on a full roster, as opposed to the 11.7, and if so, how much do you think that could maybe change decisions for some draftable players to stay in to go to college as opposed to taking that immediate money because maybe now they can get their scholarships fully paid for and be able to benefit from NIL rather than really not be able to profit from the NIL as much as they are now?
I think it depends what tier of player you're talking about.
Mhm.
Typically, in I don't know, 90+% of times, if a player signs a contract with a major league team, as part of that, his school is covered for whatever is left. So, say you're one of these kids that's sophomore eligible, you sign it for 2 years. A free 2 years of college is in your contract. Now, not every kid takes that because it has to be within, I think it's either 5 or 7 years of retiring. There's like a whole process you have to go to. You have to sort of submit paperwork and do this whole thing. And not everybody does that, as you can probably guess.
Mhm.
So those last couple of years are sort of provided for, if not always taken. And for elite players, often will be all over the summer circuit, rich parents. And so the idea of paying for school isn't like a huge problem. But like you're saying, maybe there's a D2 guy that transfers in that's thinking about hanging around. He's on the borderline. Maybe he's a guy that gets NIL and would only sign for 200K as a, eligible sophomore, stay for an extra year. And then some of these guys that are maybe below the section I'm talking about, where it's like, do I want to sign for 300K or go to school and get 100% full ride and maybe a little NIL money? Then that's like a totally different conversation. For that guy, it's a giant difference. So I think it's going to be different for every sort of guy. Unfortunately for baseball, a lot of the top players tend to be baseball only, rich parents, travel, baseball, all that kind of stuff. I think one of the bigger things that may happen is earlier in the process when kids are 12, 13, 14, and they're picking a sport, baseball always gets pushed to the side over basketball and football because they have full rides and baseball doesn't. And so maybe now at that stage, guys will keep baseball alive as an option later. And in baseball, you can get paid out of high school. Doesn't really happen in those other sports. And you still have the NIL money, you get the payday, you don't have the concussions, you have bigger rosters, bigger minors. I think the whole like sort of ecosystem is a little friendlier if you're on the borderline or if you're not a quarterback, basically. And so I think that'll be a big factor for guys that's in that situation specifically.
Yeah, great explanation. Kiley McDaniel from ESPN joining us. Last thing, give me your perspective on some of the Tennessee players that not only are in the minor leagues but have quickly gotten to Major League Baseball. There have been 5 coached by Tony Vitello that have made it to Major League Baseball. Jordan Beck was quickly through. He was part of that 2022 team. We've seen Drew Gilbert have success. So who are some of the top guys you think that are prospects from the University of Tennessee in the minor league systems or just new into Major League Baseball?
Yeah, this actually came up. I was talking to a scout about, I think it was when Jordan Beck came up and I was talking to him about my draft list. And he was like, go back and look at that Tennessee team because you had like Tidwell, who's getting close, Gilbert, who's getting close, Dolander, who's like been really good in A ball. Obviously, some of these guys, like I think Beam was a freshman on that team 2 years ago, and
Hmm.
so obviously he was there. He's about to get drafted. I think Burke was a freshman on that team.
Yep.
And
Or
then, like you mentioned, with Joyce and Beck and some of these guys, they got there really fast, which a lot of these college guys, if you sign at 21 and you get there by like 25, like that's pretty good. And getting there in like 2 years is like, even for first round picks like Beck is like kind of weird. So I kind of have a feeling, and it seemed like you kind of land on the same thing I did, that like that team from 2 years ago where I was, sort of chuckling watching all the people streaming into the SEC tournament game. I was like, oh, like all at one point, it's like the first time the team has been this good in a while, and they're very talented and they have all these really great players, which is great.
Mhm.
And then everybody gets to go there as like a cultural thing. And also, we might look back at it 10 years from now and be like, oh, there's like three major league all-stars on that team and nine big leaguers. And what like that happens every now and then. I remember growing up in Tampa, I would go see the Florida Gators games, and they had a couple of those teams where it was just like the entire weekend rotation made the big leagues, and also the Tuesday and Wednesday starter made the big
Yep.
leagues. We just saw Christian Scott was like the fifth best pitcher on his Florida team and just made his big league debut this week and was really
Right.
good. Every now and then when you're really good at scouting and development and you kind of have a deep roster, you don't know what to do with all these guys. Like I have a feeling might be the case next year with all those freshmen coming in. Like this could be one of those uh, incoming freshman classes that like sets the team up for 2 or 3 more years because you just get all this momentum and all these guys that are good immediately and playing, and you kind of want to stay when you're playing early on a really good team. Yeah, I kind of think like obviously Tony would be like the common thread of all of this stuff, and so it's obviously quite impressive what he's done. And I'm pretty sure it's his first head coaching job, right? He was just the
Yeah.
assistant, came over, and then this
Mhm.
place just like exploded immediately. So obviously a lot of credit due to him, and sounds like he's getting paid handsomely.
Yeah, for sure. And same core assistant staff with Josh Elander, associate head coach, recruiting coordinator. I'm sure you're well aware of him. And then Frank Anderson, as good a pitching coach as there is in the country, the whole time with Coach Vitello. So development, stability, I mean, all those things part of the equation. Any longer, man. Awesome stuff. Hopefully we can catch up some more down the road. But tell everyone about your 2.0 real quick and where they can find it.
Oh yeah, just go to ESPN.com. You want to go /MLB to be sure, but it's on
Mhm.
the main page. You can find it. I went 154 players deep. I just sort of cut off where it felt like all the names looked the same, although obviously it was right before three Tennessee commits. So maybe you guys would have liked me to go a little bit further. I did a mini mock draft. I did 13 picks, which is about as far as it felt like I could actually go without just like throwing darts and guessing. There's like some pretty good intel there about who's going to go where. A ton of college hitters, so probably guys as like Tennessee fans you'll actually be familiar with. A lot of SEC players in there. And this year's first round might have like 17 college hitters in it. So it's going to be some guys you're familiar with, not a bunch of high school guys. And then I have all kinds of stuff coming up. I have to actually call my editor after we're done here to talk about all the things I'm going to write between now and draft day. But suffice to say, it'll be a lot of words, and you guys will be mentioned a lot.
Well, I tell you what, crazy appreciate the fact that you included the commits, the schools where they're committed to, rather than me looking it up on different
Oh yeah.
websites. You provide it there because that's a part of the story in for college baseball fans. So that's an awesome feature in that for you guys to see. All right, this team has this amount of commits and things like that, including Tennessee represented. Kiley it's at Kiley MCD, and you can find his work on ESPN.com. Thank you so much, Kiley. Appreciate it. And have a great rest of the week. And we'll catch up with you hopefully again soon.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right. That is Kiley McDaniel, another Tampa guy. We'll talk about Tampa with him off air. This is 99.1, the Sports Animal.